It's March 5th, 1960. And another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Now, if I just say Che Guevara, I know you're already thinking of the iconic image taken today in history in 1960 of a handsome, angry young revolutionary brooding in a beret. It's been endlessly reproduced as pop art, as the poster that graced a gazillion student bedrooms, and even found its way onto the Cuban 3-peso banknote. But on this day, when it was taken at a mass funeral, even the newspaper it was taken for declined to publish it.
Yeah, that's maybe not so surprising considering that also in attendance were such luminaries as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who were admirers of Che, who were actually in Cuba at his invitation. And actually in its uncropped form, it's understandable to see why it didn't necessarily grab the editor of Revolucion's eye. It was taken from about 25 feet away. There were two shots, and when you look at them, one of them has a palm tree in, this sort of the profile of somebody's face. They don't look the same in the uncropped form.
Yeah, so the funeral that the photo was taken at was a service for the 136 people who were killed when a French ship that was carrying arms to Havana was sabotaged and blown up. And crowds had filled the streets of Havana to come out and see this event. And again, you know, the headline act was Castro giving the funeral oration. And so it's not so surprising that the story wasn't illustrated with a photo of Che Guevara, who was looking incredibly handsome, particularly because he didn't always look incredibly handsome, but in this photo he certainly does. But also because, you know, the event was very much about something else, and the main speaker was Castro himself.
And this was at the height as well, really, of Castro's personality cult. He'd only come to power in Cuba the year before, and he was blaming the Americans in his funeral oration for this boat having exploded.
And if you're the editor of one of the main newspapers in Cuba, I'm sure you know who's meant to be in the photo that's going to grace one of the state organs that day.
But for the photographer, his eye caught something else. Now, the photographer was Alberto Corda, who actually took Che Guevara's photo hundreds of times, and he describes the moment thusly: "At the foot of a podium decorated in mourning, I had my eye to the viewfinder of my old Leica camera. I was focusing on Fidel and the people around him. Suddenly, through the 90mm lens, Che emerged above me. I was surprised by his gaze. By sheer reflex, I shot twice, horizontal and vertical. I didn't have time to take a third photo, as Che stepped back discreetly into the second row. It all happened in half a minute." And that just reminded me of when we were talking about the front cover of the Beatles' Abbey Road. And there was basically like one shot where they all look like the Beatles on Abbey Road and all the others are terrible.
Yeah.
He only took 2 pictures of Che Guevara in this instant, and one has gone on to be the most reproduced photo of all time.
Yeah, and I think maybe some of the explanation for that lies in the fact that Corda was originally a fashion photographer, a field he said he got into in order to meet beautiful women. And he did later marry a model, so, you know, it weren't exactly as he planned. Yeah, and although by this time he had become an intimate of Fidel Castro and he'd been chronicling Castro's insurgency pretty much from the front line, the fact that he did come from this fashion background, although it might seem a bit counterintuitive, you know, fashion photography is all about making your model look amazing. And that's exactly what that shot does for Che Guevara. You know, the same can be said for the best of fashion photography as well. It's not just about capturing the subject in a moment where they look particularly beautiful, but if you can catch what seems to be something from inside of them coming out, and you see that in this photo, you know, he's got that very intense stare, which even though he could have just been looking to the distance thinking about what he was going to have for dinner, it tells you something, or at least it allows you to infer something about that person, and that has definitely stood the test of time.
Che himself foresaw his own iconic status. You know, he knew, I think, that he was going to be more than just a man, but, you know, a myth for some people, an ideal for others, a symbol of opposition and dissent. You know, even moments before his own death, when he was shot to death by a soldier of the Bolivian government, Che had told his executioner...
He was like, "No, stand over there, get my best angle."
Almost.
Not in the face, not in the face.
Pretty close. What he said was, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." You know, he was saying, you're sort of striking down the man, but the myth is going to
My ideas
live on.
Except the ideas don't live on, because you read what he actually stood for, and, you know, for example, in his will, he praised the, quote, "extremely useful hatred that turns men into effective, violent, merciless and cold killing machines."
Yeah.
You know, this is what he really stood for, was total Castro communism across the world. And yes, after he was dead, people were looking for a charismatic image of him, and that's how this photo became famous. More on that in a second. But in this photo becoming famous, it actually misrepresents what he really stood for, because you can interpret it so many ways.
Yeah, and it misinterprets the specificity of it too. You know, he was a single-minded activist in a specific time and place, and he had a specific ideology, which he elaborated in several books and pamphlets, etc. And now this image of him is used by Christian groups, it's been used in the LGBTQ community, and just as capitalism, you know, the sheer bold capitalism that's embodied by the fact that it appears on pretty much every kind of trinket and, you know, cheap throwaway item under the sun.
But the reason the photo eventually did get into the public sphere is because, look, years passed where the photo was just on the wall of Korda's studio because he liked the image. I think he knew that it was a pretty special photo after he'd cropped out the palm trees and the guff. And he gave a few prints to friends over the years. But the game-changing moment was a day in 1967 when an Italian publisher, Giangiacomo Feltrinelli, came with a letter from the Cuban government asking Korda to help find a portrait of Che. And he pointed to the one on his wall and he was like, well, look, that's the best one I've got. Do you want one of those? And Feltrinelli ordered 2 prints. And when he came to pick them up the next day, Korda said that because he was a friend of the revolution, Feltrinelli just didn't have to pay for them and he sent him on his way.
And, I mean, this is what's extraordinary. At no point did Korda ever make any money out of this image. Now, I know that he lived in communist Cuba and believed in that. But even so, like, he could have made a lot of money for the regime of communist Cuba, but didn't. And the reason that that was the case is that Castro himself had declared in this year in 1967 that he thought intellectual property was anti-communist and abstract and meaningless. He said, quote, "Who pays Shakespeare? Who pays Cervantes?" Is he not realising that it does expire after a few hundred years?
People did pay them.
Yeah. Queen Elizabeth I, mate.
Korda just had to sit there being like, yeah, me too. I think intellectual copyright sucks as well.
Viva the revolution, you guys. Yeah.
And therefore, Cuba had kind of de facto adopted the decision to abolish intellectual property at the very moment they finally had a thing people wanted to print. Feltrinelli, meanwhile, back in Europe, nicknamed the photo Che in the Sky with Jacket, which was a riff on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, chart hit of the time.
What drug was that referencing secretly?
I mean, this was the ideal time for a single, powerful, unifying image of leftism to gain traction. It was just before, you know, the summer of 1968, the student uprisings across Europe and stretching into the US as well, obviously, where you had the anti-Vietnam movement. I think now the idea of left-wing students sporting Che t-shirts is beyond cliche, but in 1968, it certainly would have been spicy in the US. Because you mentioned, Ollie, that when you actually look at what he wrote, it was pretty intense. And that was very much true of his opinion on the USA as well, whom he called the greatest enemy of mankind. And the last ever article he wrote was entitled, "Create 2, 3, many Vietnams."
Right, exactly. I mean, a few of his stock phrases do remain in circulation for the faithful in Cuba. The highest level of the human species is being a revolutionary, is one. The true revolutionary is guided by big feelings of love, is another.
Oh, that's better.
They're a bit more palatable, aren't they, to an international audience?
Sounds a bit like a bad translation.
I mean, the image is just so much more famous and straightforward for people to engage with. Although, of course, the image that we're looking at isn't really Korda's photo, is it? Most people have seen it against the red background. That was the work of Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick, who put it into one of those Warhol-style high-contrast drawings.
Che's daughter, Aleida, actually says that had he lived, she thinks that he would have approved of what the image became, because she said that despite all the obvious ubiquitous exploitation that has gone on in the years since, she says it would have made her father happy because, quote, he probably would have been delighted to see his face on the breasts of so many beautiful women.
I mean, it is ironic that someone who hated everything capitalism stood for ended up having their image propagated basically by people paying for it.
Right.
In reproductions that were unauthorized and up there with reproductions of like the Mona Lisa and Marilyn Monroe with her skirt blowing in the air.
Everyone got rich out of it except anyone to do with communism.
Yeah.
This episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/Wiki.
Retrospective.